Игорь Завадскyi, представитель компании Logrus Украина, главный редактор, идеолог.
We greet our next speaker, Igor Zavadskyi, Logrus Ukraine, is chief editor for IT industry, and I think it's the Microsoft terminology that is your key, that you're most known for. I'm more a practitioner than an ideologist. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. My presentation will not be on terminology, but rather on translation quality assurance. In the previous presentations, this topic was mentioned, but we were rather speaking on the control of supply control, meaning supply quality assessment, and I will focus on another aspect, which is control of quality of the work completed, which is a narrow aspect. The first thing that comes up that I have to say when speaking on quality control is standards. And speaking about on standards, we mainly have to mention the standard the 1901 standard, at least because all Western customers require certification to the standard. They demand that, and the majority of suppliers of LSPs are proud if they have such a certification, if they are certified to this standard. In fact, it defines the kind of minimum standard, the required minimum for entry to the market, and this does not. But this does not speak. But this does not show the real quality of the services provided. Moreover, I'll start with this argument, the argument that might seem contradictory, that 1901 standard has discredited itself, at least in this market. There's one example is that there's an office in Kiev with a telephone number like 340-9001, and they promise to certify your organization to 9001 within the shortest possible time, and they will not be interested in what and how you have your processes structured. In fact, there's an office that will provide a paper to. The situation is the same as with the certificates of higher education, the graduate degree in Ukraine. For example, the certificate. I have the certificate, the graduate certificate at the University of Shevchenko, at the Kiev University named after Shevchenko, and there's someone who graduates from a much less reputable university, and they get the same kind of a certificate, graduation certificate. Many LSPs are indeed happy to use these services because it makes their life simpler. They seemingly prove that they have this certification, and therefore the customers don't have to go deep into the process in the company. Allegedly, they don't want to know and they don't need to know because we're certified. We have a specific process that is quality control process, and it's absolutely none of your business how it is organized. But we boil it down to the so-called lemon market. The lemon market is a term that was coined in the 1930s in the US, and it referred to the car market when it was saturated with the very low quality used cars that were put into some kind of order and sold together with the good cars, and always sold together. But the reason why anything could be sold at the same price was that there was this phenomenon of information asymmetry, meaning that the supplier knew much more about the product quality than the customer. The result was, first of all, that the suppliers themselves suffered, because that led to a sharp price decrease. Because we might in normal market situation there is a choice, and when everybody is good, but we sell, but the prices are different, everybody will go to the sellers, to those who sell at low prices, and no one will really want to get to know what they're about. And the 9001 standard is not a mechanism like that, is not a tool for that. This is a regulation that requires a presence of a documented quality control process. Speaking about the type of process and the quality of this process itself, the standard does not regulate that. The only thing it requires is the presence of the existence of this certificate. There's a requirement that control quality processes are improved, but it does not describe what the essence of the standard. Moreover, it has nothing to do with the translation industry. It might have to do with car manufacturers, chocolate producers, and so on, and so this certificate seemingly applies to all. And the question is, where do we get? How can we speak about our language standards for LSPs? This is first of all a European standard. There's no global standard so far, but there's EN 15038 standard, and it's now used as the basis for the ISO 17100 standard that's now under development, which applies directly to LSPs. But if we look at what's inside this standard, it defines the main terms, procedures, parties to the process, parties to the interaction. But if we look at what's in standard on quality control, then we will only find one small paragraph, which is item 3.4, which states practically the same, that there should be goals formulated, that the process has to be in place, the quality monitoring process has to be in place, and it speaks on taking corrective actions. The process should be should apply to the processing of information and materials that is described in item 4.5, and this item says that if there are any problems and discrepancies with the client, we have to get in contact and find out what's wrong, and otherwise the materials are to be controlled in accordance with item 3.4 that only prescribes that the process has to be in place. No, it isn't. We cannot. And if we ask whether or not most language service providers satisfy these requirements, they absolutely do. Therefore, unfortunately, if we compare our markets with, for example, motor car industry, is very much underdeveloped, and we can compare it to the 1930s in the US, because the motor car industry is far ahead of us. When I choose a car, I never look at whether or not they have 9001 standard. I don't want to know about the red tape process, about how the processes are documented. It's none of my business, but instead of that, they provide a lot of important technical information on crash tests, on the testing rigs for the engines, on the drive tests for the cars. There's a plethora of plethora of information. And that's how the manufacturers of cars compete. And when we compete, we don't have a set of these crash tests, drive tests. There's no set of technical characteristics that we could provide to the customers in order to make sure that they can realistically appraise the quality of our work. And this results in the fact that whose offices the good faith providers of high quality language services, because de facto they are placed on equal terms, on equal footing with the low quality providers. And we face this challenge each day, that the price is not just becoming the main parameter, but rather the only parameter for the customer. The customer will go to any Chinese agency that uses Google Translate just because they charge 3 cents instead of 5. And we don't have tools to show that we are good and the Chinese company are bad. There's no tool, there are no international standards, then there's no single model for quality assessment. And it is the goal of my presentation to show the first steps that Logrus is taking in the direction of setting up such a model by developing kind of basic criteria, fundamental principles that can underlie this system, that will be comprehensible for both customers and for the customers and apply to the market in general. We'll look at these basic things. But first of all, let's distinguish between the relevant and irrelevant things. What do we mean by LQA? When we speak of LQA, we do not understand what we mean, because it can mean language quality assurance or language quality assessment, and these are two totally different things. And these three processes of quality assurance and quality control and quality assessment, I place them in the three boxes, like the Russian Matryoshka doll. That's inserted in where each box is inserted in the other one. But what's the most important for quality assurance process is that this is the most overreaching process, and but this will not exist without the central core with add-ons. Quality assurance is a kind of action that we take to follow up the control, meaning that meaning a number of measures taken based on the results of assessment. There's a lot of information on quality assurance in the materials by the ATA, SMT, and so on. And there are a lot of there's an industry standard with lots of general principles set, but no specifics. We mostly focus on quality control and quality assessment, but when we speak about quality assessment, I do not really understand what we mean by that, because there's also language quality control, LQC, and what do we mean by control? Do we mean management, or do we indeed mean monitoring or control? Because there's a kind of double-barreled phrase that can be interpreted in different ways. Both LQA and LQC are not stable terms. We can understand their meaning in Russian, but not in English, and therefore we will adhere to the Russian terminology. But there has to be a harmonization at the international level. As for this second box, which is in the middle between the inner and the outer ones, there's a lot in SMT on control. It's not only assessment in itself, not only measurements. But this is about the control process as it is, meaning who has to be involved in control, which projects have to be are subject to control, and so on. But here in Logrus, we have phrased three main points which describe quality control. They say what you shouldn't do when performing quality control. We should not edit the text, even though the customers might ask for that. Here we can compare. Here is LKA, and editing can be compared to diagnostics and treatment of a patient. We have diagnosed a disease and we can treat that. But if the diagnosis shows that the disease is due to a unhealthy lifestyle, this will mean that we have eliminated consequence rather than the reason of the disease. But the same happens if we start editing during LKA, and the customers get happy and they give us a job to edit more and more. But this is not an elimination of the cause. We have to identify the cause and to make sure that it is eliminated. And it's natural. The second point is that you cannot use the same supplier who has done the translation for LKA, especially when we are speaking on assessments that are seemingly a pass, but in fact are not a pass. Like the pass will be at 90 points, and in fact you get 88 points, and there's a kind of trade-off where you add these 2 points, and the company passes the certification and process, but in fact the processes are not improved. And another important requirement that is very often violated is that you have to use linguists for LK, because very often clients will refer the documents to the regional office, because they will say that linguists are too particular about commas and full stops, and they're not really practical about the assessment. But in the regional offices, they tend to use an over-creative approach. They consider themselves good writers, and that's where we get the horrible combinations and horrible semi-Russian, semi-English words and texts. As an editor, I cannot use the terms that are suggested after the assessment, and we have to exchange a lot of letters to explain that marketing is one thing and linguistics is totally different, and this practice is unacceptable. LK has to be performed by linguists. As regards terminology, the normal practice is to use glossaries, and linguists can check the glossaries. In some cases, it is possible that a representative of a company can have a better idea of some specific aspects, but he will never be able to perform linguistic LQA better than an expert linguist. Moreover, it's best to have LQA experts rather than just general editors, but specific experts on language quality assurance. But there are very few companies that can afford that. As regards the quality control, but instead of assessment, we are now speaking about the core, the main thing that underlies translation quality assessment. There are standards in this sphere as well, the LISA standard. Unfortunately, this organization does not exist anymore, but nonetheless, they published standards that included measurement tools for different types of documents, such as linguistic assessment, formatting, and help, and in context review. There are specific and different measurement tools for these aspects. But and despite their diversity, they are all very straightforward. All mistakes get 1 point, major 5 points, and critical 10 points. This is the wrong way to act. We can understand that depending on the circumstances, the stylistic error cannot be assessed, can be given the same points, the same rank as the mistranslation. So this is an obsolete, we can say that's an obsolete method now. When we speak on the Association of Motor Car Engineers, they have their own model to assess translation quality, but the differences are much subtler here. You can see 5, 2, 1, 3 for different types of errors, and this shows penalty points, but this model is only good for technical texts. If we look at the serious wrong term, the 5 points is removed for that, and only 2 points are removed for punctuation. It's okay where we describe cars, but in case of a marketing text, one comma can play a much more important role, and we know about mistakes, about errors that are where a comma is placed in the wrong place in a sentence, and this means that both assessment models are not flexible. The first one being unflexible in terms of points, and the other one in terms of application. Let's formulate, just like we have formulated that in Logrus, let's formulate the starting points discuss the model for quality assessment. First of all, the model has to be universal. There has to be a single methodological approach used for all types of materials, be it technical, marketing, medical, legal, or anything else. Secondly, it has to apply to both human and machine translation, even though these are different things, but in fact they have to be assessed using the same model, and it has to be independent of the volume and complexity of the project. We're not speaking on writing a universal table, but rather on a model that can be broken down by parameters. There has to be a set of parameters which will make it applicable to the translation of a technical text to a marketing text, and that can be adapted to different standards set by the customer and so on. Thirdly, the model has to be simple enough to make sure that the customer is able to understand this. This is a measurement tool for the customer to explain them how a better supply can be differentiated from a worse one. It's extremely important, even though it's subjective, that the model has to be fair. I don't know how we can describe this in a standard. This word does not exist in standards, but still this is the key problem that a QA expert faces, as well as the translator. There are lots of claims, and there are lots of complaints. This guy is not fair. This guy is using a biased approach. Unfortunately, we cannot avoid this completely, but we can minimize this. And I will show how we minimize, how we reduce the number of these flops. In this case, I will describe the advantages advantages of our model, and there's we can also have to speak about economic efficiency because the model is inefficient, but it is still used because it is a QA model, a QA tool, and allegedly it helps us perform QA. Speaking on the Logrus model, first of all, it's a two-level model. In terms of the use of criteria, there are three types of criteria possible. The first being subjective, meaning whether I like it or not, and then I like it or I don't like it, and or the text sounds somehow disturbingly. This model has to get rid of subjective criteria. They shouldn't be taken into account. The second type of criteria are semi-objective, or we can name they are also known as expert assessment. The readability and adequacy being the two most important of them. Speaking on readability, if this is machine translation that was done by a bad tool, we cannot go on with assessment whatsoever. Speaking on adequacy, there can be very readable texts, but the fact is that the translator does not understand what the original says, and they just invent a text of their own. And you can see that at first sight. Why we distinguish these criteria is because we can scan the text, spend 10 minutes reading it, and find out whether or not it's readable or adequate. It's only when both of these criteria are satisfied at a specific threshold, readability threshold, we can say, only then it makes sense to pass over to a detailed QA and to use objective assessment criteria. That's this third criteria, which are specific errors that have to do with terminology, grammar, and specificity, precision. But we only can take this step if the first step is successfully completed. We can use different types of scales to do that, but it's outside of the basic framework. Why this expert assessment is important is because it's easy to understand that if the text is not readable, whether or not we're speaking about readability of machine or non-machine translation, or readability for a robot or a human being, it doesn't really matter, because readability is an absolute value, irrespective of the circumstances. It does not make sense to check the text if it is incomprehensible or it is not adequate. Normally it's easy to see that you spend just 10 minutes and instead of 3 hours, and you save money. We only have 10 minutes to go. And because we have to discuss the Logrus model, and we still have to leave some time for questions and answers. Speaking on the threshold value, you will ask how we can assess readability and adequacy. We can use a 10-point scale, but what do we use as plus or minus? This can be variated. If this is a good human translation, then we can the minimum will be 5. If this is machine translation, we can grade it at 3, but the QA experts will not be told about that. They don't need to focus on what kind of translation it is. they have they just have success equality. I will show you the good and the bad, the good and the bad too. Why we shouldn't mix expert or semi-objective criteria with objective criteria, meaning that we use the threshold, the threshold of experts assessment. First of all, their nature is different. The first ones are local, the second ones are global, and secondly, expert assessment is not precise. When one expert comes and they would think that the text has to be evaluated at 6, the other experts will say this will be evaluated at 8. There are different views, there are different opinions. There is an expert that will say that you can only give 10 points to if the translation was done by God himself. We have to be sure that the text passes the threshold point, the threshold score of 5, and otherwise it's not really important whether or not the score is 6 or 8. If we do not obey that principle, what happens if we do not obey this principle? I mentioned inefficient and efficient tool. There was a QA of 1,000 words, and by objective criteria, there were only 2 minor errors identified per 1,000 words. This would seemingly be a good text. The threshold value is 90. If we these are the experts' assessment between 4 and 1 and 4. If we use that, we'll get we'll assess it at 95.37. But no one will award the score of 4. The score will likely be 3.9 rather than 4. No one will. What if I enter 3.9 in these in these cells, and here is what we get: 89.12, and this will not be passed. 3.9 will be maximum, and if the expert is very particular, they will not give the maximum score, and then the text is not past the assessment. When the subjective and objective, that's what happens when subjective and objective criteria are combined. 75% of objective assessment and 25% of semi-objective assessment, which brings us down to much lower value, to much lower score. The difference might seemingly be minor, but the consequences will be catastrophic. When I tried to understand the reason for this situation, here's the graph here. This is the graph of translation of score of semi-objective assessment into percent. Up to 3.9, the line is, the vector is like that, and after 3.9, it goes steeply forward. It goes steeply up. The steepness difference between the two lines lines is 10 times. So the second line is 10 times steeper than the first one. And as soon as we have realized that, as QI experts, we started saying that 3.9 will be the minimum. We warned the clients that 3.9 is rather bad, rather low. And then we face the situation where the score will be 3.954, and this is really unfair if we curve the line like this, because people think human thinking is linear, and if and the difference if we change the 1/10 will lead to to a higher difference than if we look at 2 and 2.5. And the difference is important the author of this curve says that if the quality is premium, then everything should be at the maximum, and if something is wrong, something minor is wrong, then this is not premium any longer, and you have to go out of business if your results, if your translations, if your score is not lower than 4. We kept writing letters and we kept discussing that, but this is not because we are bad, but because of the absent situations that we face. A reviewer will write on one, okay guys, you have wonderful text quality, everything is excellent, and that's why I give you the score of 3.9. It's almost 4, and that's how only one mistake brings us below the threshold, and we do not pass, we fail. This has to be avoided, and the only way is to avoid combining semi-objective and objective assessment. Semi-objective assessment will be just a threshold with the broad acceptability range. We can look at the model in the form of Excel, but to take a look at the objective criteria. If we go to the next slide. And then we will see our assessment model, our LQA form. It's you can break it down by parameters depending on the type of text, and we can also include the complexity and the customer's wishes and so on. There are a few pages with the complete vector of parameters set here. The complete breakdown by the type of mistakes and so on. On the general form list in this cell, we choose the type of text. The PM or reviewer or the reviewer doesn't work here. These are very fundamental conceptual things. And the PM just chooses the type here using this list, and then the whole model is built on these parameters, with specifying the threshold percentage and other values. What is the parameters shown are the readability and adequacy threshold based on the 10 point scale, the number of the names of objective criteria, and the number of the objective criteria, and the number and name of the severity error. There can be 2 or 3 of them depending on the specific case. There are different points for mistakes of different, for one mistake of different degree, severity degree. We break it down by the principle of translation of transition of translation into percentage. How many penalty points per 1,000 words will remove 10% of the overall evaluation? How many points you have to score to get 90% instead of 100%? And there's also a threshold parameter of the number of the high severity errors. If the threshold of critical mistakes is higher than 2, then the text is no good, irrespective of any other criteria. And one more Excel table, this one.
Вот, то есть, смотрите, вот здесь вот, да вот так, в общем-то, получается.
In this cell, if we look at this cell, it's here that we choose the type, for example, marketing, and then everything is recalculated. In marketing, we get the fluency and intelligibility categories. If we choose technical, we will not have these categories. This error will not be viewed as an error. And also, depending on the choice of the text type, we get the concrete errors list where we can choose, where we can form lists. This list is for technical text, and if we choose marketing or any other type of text here, or machine translation, then the concrete errors page will contain a different list with a different number of severity degrees. All this exists in the form of one list of parameter vectors, and the PM only chooses the name of this vector parameter, and that's how everything is changed. And in addition, in accordance with our threshold objective, semi-objective assessment list, if we look at adequacy, we do not calculate, we do not estimate the objective criteria whatsoever. And that's how we use the threshold-based approach. Speaking of critical errors, if the number of the high severity errors is higher than the threshold value, then we also use this drop-down menu to choose a relevant legend. For example, major row limit failed. This does not pass based on this category. That's how the model looks. First of all, this is a universal model. This applies to any type of text. Secondly, this is efficient because we get rid of those texts that are bad by default. The flexibility means that it adapts to any demands and minimum subjectivity. With this threshold of 5 out of 10, if you do not pass the threshold, it should mean that you indeed do not work, that your text does not work indeed, rather than because of the inobjectivity. And the main thing is that all our functions are linear, because human thinking is linear, and you can only feel that your assessment is fair because if it is linear. And 3, and that's our experience, our practice, our first practical steps, and our general points, and it would be very good if similar models, sets of parameters are discussed and standardized, just like the model of their use. We have to discuss how we can use that. Then we will get the same that happened in the American motor car markets in the 1930s, when the government introduced regulations, a number of technical parameters that each specific car has to satisfy. That's how we will be able to show our clients how we can differentiate between the good and the bad. And unfortunately, there's not so much which is similar in terms of standards. The standards are very general, and they do not give any significant information. Thank you for your attention. I'm ready for your questions. As for the types of text, so they're technical, marketing, in context review, or with certain different criteria, and machine translation, which is also a specific type of text. But we also have to do that for medical and legal text. Are you ready to share this formula as a head of an office? I would be very much interested to look at these parameters. Fyodor is nodding his head, and that's the question more to him than to anyone else. My question is, your assessment model is designed for practically ideal circumstances where the customer provides initially good text, but where the original text is not good quality, we can ask the customer to edit that, but it's very rarely that the customer will agree to do that. And how do you assess the quality of the translator's work? Because any of the parameters will, on any of the parameters, the text will fail. It will be either for adequacy or quality. A bad source text is a real disaster, because the LSP finds themselves in a very uncomfortable position. But in this case, we just reduce the threshold value, giving the score of 3 rather than 5. It should be adequate, but not perfectly adequate. I didn't think that we will see such an emotional response when we spoke on the widespread mistakes, where you mentioned that you cannot involve non-linguists. I'm strongly against involving linguists whatsoever. Just by way of an example, there are two doctors. There's a joke. Two doctors are speaking. There's an X-ray. There's an X-ray, and they will discuss how we will look at the X-ray. When two engineers are talking on some parts of a car, you as a linguist will not try to impose your opinion on them. The same as with physicians. You will not assess an X-ray in their stead. But it's not for the engineers, but rather for, say, laymen. But if this is a document that is designed that is written by doctors and for doctors, and if the linguists read this text and correct some industry-specific term for a generic one, and then discuss and explain that this text, this term does not exist. This will be wrong. When the text is designed for for a limited number of people, this is not typical for LSPs. When I submit an article and an editor by the software or a manual that will then be published, this is very specific, very narrow specifics. In this case, where the text is designed for a narrow specialist by a narrow specialist, in this case, the different approach is more appropriate. When we look for supplies for Russian bureaus, for Russian trade and translation agencies, I persuade my customers to not to avoid this. Thank you. And no more questions. Thank you for your attention.